Hi, I'm Jocelyn and welcome to Jocelyn Crafts. And this week, instead of doing a cutesy craft, we're going to do a craft that focuses on sustainable living. At times like these, when we see how much supply chains can be disrupted and how much sometimes we need to just rely on what we have at home, it's important to practice sustainable living crafts. And this one is about mending clothing, primarily socks. I am going to teach you how to darn socks. And this is a long, old traditional craft that has largely fallen by the wayside as clothing has become cheaper and more disposable. And right now, the fashion industry is the cause of massive amounts of waste in our society. It goes into landfills because people just buy these cheap clothes and then throw them away. So if we can learn to mend some of our clothing and make it last longer, we can help reduce the amount of waste that we are contributing to society. I'm going to just show with socks, but the same technique can be used with things like t-shirts and sweaters. And you can even use contrasting colored threads to add a new decorative element and make your repair actually a fashion statement. So let's get to it. Okay, so this is a sock that I have already repaired through darning. And basically you are putting new fabric where the old fabric has worn away. And it's sort of a combination of embroidery and weaving, which I've done a little bit of in two of my previous videos. And I know that socks seem pretty disposable, but if you get a comfy pair of socks in cute colors and you really like it, why throw it away when it starts to wear thin? Go ahead and reinforce it. So this is the sort of thing that you can repair with a darn. This has a small hole and the fabric has gotten thin. And that's an ideal sock to repair with darning. I have fixed ones with even larger holes, but this is a good size to start with. And you can even think ahead and just do some darning when the fabric is getting thin and you know it's going to get a hole soon. If you can be proactive, I don't always succeed at that. So to darn socks, the supplies are so easy. You need a needle. I'm using a thin tapestry needle, but if you've got embroidery needles or even a larger size hand sewing needle, that will work. And obviously you need your socks that have holes in them. And then you can try a number of different fiber options you could use. Embroidery floss, and depending on how thick your socks are, these can be split into 6 smaller strands. And if you have really thick socks, you could use 2 or 3 strands. If you have thin socks, you could use 1 strand. For thin socks, you could even use sewing thread, either single or doubled. Another option that I have been using for my thicker socks is I bought this cake of yarn that comes as these 4 thinner strands that are barely plied together. And so you could pull these apart and use these singly or doubly. For my thicker socks, I'm using a double strand of this thin yarn. Then you need something to stretch your sock across. You could use a very small embroidery hoop, and I know at some craft supply places you can even get something called a darning egg or a darning mushroom, which are these shapes made out of wood that you can stretch the sock over. But why spend money when you can do something like this? I'm just going to take my sock. This is one that I've already started work on, and I'm going to just finish it for you. And you can just stretch it across a cup, a glass cup, or a mason jar so that the hole is stretched tight. And I'm going to finish that darn for you in a minute. And you can hold it down with just a hairband or a rubber band. to make sure that it stays in place. Now, if you have a large hole that you need to reposition often, you could also just hold it tight with your hand and reposition it from time to time. I have another one started over here that I have stretched on, another small container. Now, this is one where I am just reinforcing the fabric that is about to wear through. So let me demonstrate how to do the most basic darn on this one that the fabric is about to wear through. So you're basically using a running stitch, which is an embroidery turn where you just go down and up and down and up and down and up across. As you can see, I've already started this. So I'm going down and up and down and up and down and up. Helps to have a slightly longer needle, but you can pull it off with a small needle. You don't want to pull it too tight or it'll misshape your sock. So that's why you want to keep the sock stretched. And you just go back and forth across where you want to reinforce. And you're just adding extra fiber to the area to reinforce it so that it will take longer to wear thin. So you just go across in one direction and then go back across in the other direction. That one was a little wide spaced. I usually keep them a little closer to each other than that. Got distracted by talking and working at the same time. And you want to take your running stitches a little bit further than the area that's already worn out, because the area that is close to the worn out area is going to wear out next. And so now that whole area is pretty well covered with running stitches. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start going back in the opposite direction, and you can get some weaving action in here too. So remember, weaving, you go over one strand and under one strand and over, let me try that again. Over one and under one. And then I'm going to go over this one and under the next one. So I'm doing a running stitch and weaving at the same time. And that binds the new threads to the old fabric of the sock more tightly. But because there is still some existing fabric there, you don't have to be perfect in your weave. Like if some of your rows are too close together, like those two are pretty close together. So I'm just going to go under both of them. The key is you just want to bind these new threads inextricably with the old fabric. So it is all cinched together to make a new, thicker, stronger fabric. And there is my first row going back that way. Then you just turn it around and head back in the opposite direction. And again, you're kind of weaving and kind of doing a running stitch, sort of doing both. You just want to make sure that you are binding your new strands of thread very well together with your old fabric. And this will reinforce your sock enough to make it last a lot longer. Now, I'm not going to finish the whole thing, but I will shift to a spot that I already did here. So this is a spot where I've already finished, and you can see I did the running threads in one direction and then the other in the running stitches. And when I had ends to tack down, I don't like having a knot on the inside of my sock. Oh, I forgot to tell you, you turn your sock inside out to do this. Now you know. Turn your sock inside out. So I don't like to have a knot on the inside, so what I just do is I tack down the end with the other running stitches. And once your threads are so interwoven with the old fabric, these tacks are strong enough to hold. So anytime I had new threads introduced, I would just tack them down. And that is strong enough to last, and I'll just trim off the long edges and they're not going to pull out. Now let me show you the sock that has the bigger hole. Okay, for bigger holes, it's the same principle. I did a little bit of running stitch first on the edge of this big hole. And then I also have a few tacks of running stitch at this edge before I get to this big hole. Now we have to stretch it tight and then just stretch a long thread across the open hole. So let me demonstrate that. I'm going to do a little bit of running stitch and then you stretch the thread all the way across. What you're doing is you're creating a warp for weaving, because you're going to weave a patch to fill in this hole. So a little bit of running stitch and then stretch it across. And then end with another little bit of running stitch down there. Now I'm almost all the way through this hole here. So little bit of running stitch, stretch it across, I'm going to do a little bit more running stitch up here. Now I have a warp most of the way across this hole, but there's still some really thin fabric here, so I'm going to do running stitch through this thin area. Okay, this last stitch I took a little farther up in this direction because now I'm going to start the weaving. I'm going to try to reposition this a little bit. I'm going to have to periodically reposition this as I weave it because the hole is just a tiny bit too big to fit comfortably all the way across my opening. I almost have it. Okay, so now I'm going to start my weaving. So first, again, on these outer edges, it's more of half weaving, half running stitch as you go back through these areas that are just the thin fabric. Okay, I added another strand to do the actual weaving, and I did a little running stitch up this side to tuck it down, and then did this last row of running stitch before we get to the actual weaving. I'm going to be tacking down all these ends with running stitch as I come to them. And I took off the rubber band so I can shift it around as I need to. So first I'm doing a little bit of running stitch here, and then I will transition immediately into the weaving as I come to it. So see, it's over, under, over, under, over, under, over, then this one's going to come up under as a running stitch. I'm just holding this tight with my hands right now because I'm going to be shifting it around a lot. That was an under, so this is going to be an over, under, over, under. And then I'm going to shift to where these loose strands are on top and show you how I'm tacking them down with the running stitch. So I'm going to go over here and pull that tight. That actually got some of my strands in it. All right. So these loose strands are getting tacked down with new stitches. And every time I come to this side, I'll just make sure that they get tacked down again. And that'll hold it all nice and secure. And now back to our weaving. Under, over, under, over, under, over, under, over, under, over, under, and we're about back into running stitch again. And when I'm in the weaving section, I do try to follow the same over under pattern in my running stitch as I did in the Okay, I've got a few more rows done. As you can see, I'm just tacking down these loose threads as I go, and I'll tack them down a few more times, and when I'm ready to turn the sock back right side out, I'll cut the loose threads off. But in the meantime, I'm just going to keep on doing those running stitches and then weaving when I get to this open weaving area. So let me do a few more rows for you. Of the under, over. Now as I am weaving, I am also using the needle to sort of nudge the previous thread in so that it forms a tighter weave without too many spaces. Because when it first pulls through, it does want to migrate up here, so you kind of have to push it down a little to make it tighter. Now it is going to be a little bit of a loose weave. It's not going to be a super tight weave, but I have a trick for that I will show you after I've got a few more rows done. Let me just demonstrate one more row here. Okay, I am done with my weaving. So as you can see, there is now fabric where there was none before, but it's still pretty thin. You can see through it. It doesn't look very durable. But what is the next step, if you really want the sock to last, is now that you have fabric here, you can do running stitches through this fabric in a diagonal kind of fashion to add another layer of structure to it. So I'm going to start doing a diagonal of running stitches back and forth across my darned patch. And that will just make it even stronger. And I'm still tacking down these loose ends as I go, just to make sure that everything stays in place. And you don't have to be super particular about making sure that you have weaved in certain places. As you do these diagonal running stitches, you just want to add that one extra layer of reinforcement so that this patch that you spent all this time making by hand will actually last you more than 2 or 3 uses of the sock. Now, this was a sock that had a pretty big hole before I patched it, and that made it good to demonstrate on, but I would strongly recommend not waiting until the hole is this big and doing some work on your sock well before it gets into this state. And that is what I did on the first sock I showed you, which I still have over here. See, I started darning well before it was actually worn all the way through. So now this sock is going to last a lot longer, completely intact. And it won't need this extra diagonal because it already had the existing sock fabric there to lend its strength. Now, I said in my introduction that you can use this on clothing other than just socks. And if you Google visible mending, you'll find a lot of interesting things going on where people are using a combination of darning with decorative embroidery stitches to mend shirts, sweaters, and jeans. And it adds a new decorative element, which becomes a fashion statement and extends the life of your clothing item at the same time. So if you're interested in expanding this darning into an overall sustainability of your existing wardrobe and thinking about doing some of this decorative mending, absolutely, the thing to Google is visible mending or decorative mending. And that will get you the kind of techniques that you are looking for. But all of those are derived from this basic, good old-fashioned darning. So I'm not going to finish this for you. I think you've got the gist of it. When you're done, just take your long tail and circle it through the fabric a couple of times and then weave it through. Just make sure it's tacked down nice and good, and you can trim all the longest bits and turn your sock back right side out, and then you'll have something that looks a little bit like this. This one also had an entire hole patch. This is the mate of the one I was just working on. So as you can see, it has that diagonal running stitch through the new woven patch to give it the extra strength. And it should last me at least another year. So thank you for learning this traditional mending art with me today, and have a great week and have fun crafting. Bye-bye.